Berlin, 1943. In a grey stone building on Prince Albrechtstrasse, where the screams of the interrogated sometimes echoed through ventilation shafts, a young woman named Maria Terwil sat at her typewriter and made a decision that could get her shot before sunrise. She was 26 years old, blonde, efficient, and to everyone around her, the perfect Nazi secretary. But every morning when she walked past the SS guards and climbed the stairs to the 4th floor of Gestapo headquarters, she carried a secret that would have meant immediate execution. She was systematically destroying the Nazis' own files to save lives. Not hundreds of files, not a few dozen. We are talking about more than 600 individual dossiers, each one a death sentence waiting to be signed, each one representing a human being marked for arrest, torture, and almost certain death in the camps. And she made them disappear as if they had never existed. The Gestapo headquarters was not just any building. This was the nerve center of Nazi terror, the place where decisions about life and death were made with bureaucratic coldness. Every floor hummed with the sound of typewriters clacking, filing cabinets opening and closing, boots marching down hallways. The smell of cigarette smoke mixed with the acrid scent of fear that seemed to seep from the interrogation rooms in the basement. Maria worked in the documentation department, a position that gave her access to something incredibly dangerous: the master files of suspected enemies of the Reich. These were not random papers. These were meticulously organized dossiers on communists, Jews in hiding, resistance members, Christians who refused to salute Hitler, and anyone else the regime wanted to crush. Her job was simple and terrifying: organize them, file them, make sure every name was catalogued, every address was current, every piece of evidence was ready for when the Gestapo came knocking. She was supposed to be a cog in the murder machine. But Maria Terwil was not what she seemed. Born into a Catholic family in Munich, she had watched with growing horror as her country descended into madness. By 1938, when the synagogues burned during Kristallnacht, she knew she could not stay silent. But she also knew that open resistance meant death. So she did something almost unthinkable. She applied for a job at the very heart of the beast. She wanted to be where the killing began, where the lists were made, where the orders originated. Her plan was insane and required nerves of absolute steel. She would work for the Gestapo, gain their trust, and then sabotage them from within. When she got the job in 1941, her friends in the underground resistance thought she had lost her mind. They were wrong. She had found the perfect weapon: access. The system was supposed to be foolproof. Every file that came across her desk was numbered, cross-referenced, stamped with official seals. The Gestapo prided itself on German efficiency, on the idea that no enemy of the state could escape their paper trail. But Maria understood something that her superiors, drunk on their own power, had overlooked. The system only worked if the people running it were loyal. And she was not loyal. She was a saboteur in a cardigan and sensible shoes. Her method was brilliant in its simplicity. When a new dossier came in, she would read it quickly, assess the danger level, and if the person inside was marked for immediate arrest, she would do something extraordinary. She would refile it, not in the active investigation drawer, but in the closed cases, the dead files, the bureaucratic graveyard where papers went to be forgotten. She would change a date here, smudge a stamp there, make a file look like it had already been processed, and the suspect cleared or already dealt with. The risk was astronomical. The Gestapo employed internal investigators whose only job was to catch traitors within their own ranks. One misplaced file could trigger an audit. One suspicious colleague could report her. One angry supervisor having a bad day could decide to double-check her work. If caught, there would be no trial, no appeal, no mercy. She would be dragged to the basement, tortured until she gave up every name she knew, and then executed. Her family would be arrested. Her friends would disappear. The penalty for betraying the Gestapo was not just death, but the annihilation of everyone you loved. And yet every single day she walked into that building and committed treason. Every single day she saved lives, while SS officers walked past her desk and complimented her efficiency. The most terrifying part was not the constant danger of discovery. It was the isolation. Maria could not tell anyone what she was doing, not her parents, not her neighbors. Not even most of her resistance contacts. The fewer people who knew, the safer everyone was. So she lived a double life so complete that it would have broken most people. At work, she smiled at her supervisors, shared coffee with other secretaries, typed reports about arrests and executions with steady hands. At home, she lay awake at night, wondering if tomorrow would be the day someone noticed a missing file, if tomorrow would be the day the Gestapo came for her. But she kept going. Because somewhere in Berlin, people whose names had been on those files were still free, still breathing, still alive, because a secretary had decided that one person could make a difference. The year 1943 marked a turning point in the war, and Berlin was transforming into a city of paranoia and desperation. The victories that Hitler had promised were evaporating on the Eastern Front, where hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were freezing to death in the Russian winter. The Allied bombing raids were intensifying, turning entire neighborhoods into rubble and ash. Every night, air raid sirens would wail across the city, and people would scramble into shelters, wondering if they would see morning. But even as external enemies closed in, the Nazi regime became more obsessed with internal threats. The Gestapo was not scaling back its operations, it was doubling down. Hitler and Himmler believed that traitors within Germany were sabotaging the war effort, that Jews still in hiding were somehow undermining the Reich, that every setback was the result of betrayal rather than their own catastrophic decisions. This meant one thing for Maria: more files, more names, more lives hanging in the balance. The documentation department where Maria worked was drowning in paperwork. New dossiers were arriving daily, sometimes hourly. Informants were everywhere in Nazi Germany. Your neighbor could report you for complaining about food rations. A colleague could turn you in for making a joke about Hitler. A former friend could denounce you for listening to foreign radio broadcasts. The Gestapo encouraged this culture of suspicion, even rewarding people who informed on others. Every denunciation created a file, and every file needed to be processed, investigated, and acted upon. Maria's desk became a bottleneck of death sentences, a pile of paper that represented human beings waiting to be arrested. The workload was crushing, but for Maria it was also an opportunity. The more chaotic the system became, the easier it was to make files disappear without anyone noticing. But the pressure was building in ways that terrified her. New managers were being brought in, younger SS officers who were fanatically loyal and desperate to prove themselves. They started implementing new tracking systems, adding layers of verification that Maria had to navigate. One particular officer, an uptight bureaucrat named Klaus Hoffmann, began conducting random audits of processed files. He would show up at desks without warning, demanding to see documentation trails, asking why certain cases had been closed or delayed. Maria watched him move through the office like a predator, and she knew it was only a matter of time before he reached her desk. She could not afford to panic. Panic meant mistakes, and mistakes meant death. The resistance network that Maria was connected to was also under enormous strain. The Gestapo had infiltrated several underground cells, arresting members and torturing them for information. Communication became almost impossible. The dead drops where Maria would occasionally receive coded messages were being watched. Friends simply vanished overnight, their apartments raided, their families interrogated. Maria had to assume that at any moment someone under torture might mention her name, might reveal that there was a source inside Gestapo headquarters. She started varying her routes to work, never taking the same tram twice in a row, watching for anyone who might be following her. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but it kept her alive. Then came the incident that nearly exposed everything. A file that Maria had deliberately buried resurfaced during a routine check by another department. It belonged to a Jewish family hiding in a friend's attic, and someone had requested an update on the case. The file had been marked as closed and the suspects listed as already deported, but now a cross-departmental inquiry was asking questions. Why was there no transport record? Why was there no confirmation from the camp system? Maria had 48 hours to create a plausible explanation before the audit reached her supervisor. She was running out of time, running out of luck, and she knew that one wrong move would bring the entire house of cards crashing down on her head. Maria spent that night in her small apartment, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing through every possible solution. She could not simply make the inquiry disappear because it had already been logged in multiple departments. She could not claim the file had been lost because that would trigger an even more intensive investigation. The only option was to create a paper trail that looked legitimate, that would satisfy the auditors and make them move on to the next case. So she did something incredibly risky. The next morning she arrived at the office an hour early, before most of her colleagues, and she forged a transport document. Using official Gestapo letterhead that she had access to, she created a fake confirmation that the Jewish family in question had been processed through a transit camp in Poland 6 months earlier. She backdated it, added realistic bureaucratic language, and even included a reference number that corresponded to an actual transport that had occurred around that time. Then she filed it exactly where it should have been if the process had been legitimate. When the auditor arrived at her desk 2 days later, Maria handed him the file with steady hands and a bored expression, as if this was just another routine verification. She watched him flip through the pages, his eyes scanning the transport document she had forged. For a moment that felt like an eternity. He paused, and Maria could feel her heart pounding so hard she was certain he could hear it. But then he nodded, stamped the file as verified, and moved on to the next desk. Maria allowed herself exactly 3 seconds of relief before returning to her typewriter. She had dodged a bullet, but she knew the walls were closing in. The system was getting tighter, the scrutiny was increasing, and every day she stayed in that building was another day closer to discovery. The reality of working inside Gestapo headquarters was a psychological nightmare that most people could never understand. Maria was not hiding in shadows or sneaking through back alleys. She was sitting in plain sight, surrounded by the very people who would kill her if they knew the truth. She had coffee with SS officers who bragged about interrogations. She filed reports written by men who tortured prisoners in the basement. She typed letters signed by officials who were organizing the extermination of entire communities. And she had to do it all with a smile, with efficiency, with the appearance of absolute loyalty. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. She was betraying everything these people stood for while sitting 3 feet away from them. But Maria was not alone in her resistance, even if she felt isolated. There were others scattered throughout the Nazi bureaucracy who were also sabotaging the machine from within. She did not know most of their names and they did not know hers, but occasionally she would hear whispers of files that went missing in other departments, of orders that somehow never got delivered, of small acts of defiance that added up to something larger. These people were not dramatic heroes. They were clerks and secretaries and minor officials who had access to the paperwork that kept the death machine running, and they gummed up the gears in whatever small ways they could. Maria drew strength from knowing she was part of this invisible network, even if she could never acknowledge it openly. By the spring of 1943, Maria had successfully hidden or altered more than 300 files. 300 human beings who should have been arrested were still free because a secretary had decided their paperwork was not important enough to process immediately. Some of those people would eventually be caught through other means, but many would survive the war because of the delays Maria created. She was buying time, and in a city where the Gestapo could kick down your door at 3 in the morning, time was the most valuable currency anyone had. But the question that haunted her every single day was simple and terrifying. How much longer could she keep this up before her luck ran out? Maria's technique evolved as the risks increased. She could no longer simply refile documents into dead storage because the new tracking systems would flag the discrepancy within days. So she developed more sophisticated methods, tactics, that required her to think like the very people she was working against. When a high-priority arrest order came across her desk, she would sometimes delay it by routing it through unnecessary approval channels, adding bureaucratic steps that did not actually exist but looked official enough that no one questioned them. She would claim that a signature was needed from an officer who was currently at the front, or that additional verification was required from a department that was notoriously slow. In the maze of Nazi bureaucracy, where dozens of agencies often competed for authority, these delays seemed perfectly normal. A file that should have resulted in an arrest within 24 hours would instead sit in limbo for weeks, and by the time it finally reached the right desk, circumstances had often changed. The suspect had moved, the informant had recanted, or the case had simply been buried under more urgent matters. The psychological toll of this double life was immense. Maria could not afford to show fear, could not afford moments of hesitation or doubt. Every morning she had to put on a mask of normalcy and wear it for 10, sometimes 12 hours straight. She participated in office gossip, laughed at her supervisor's jokes, attended mandatory Nazi party functions where she had to raise her arm in the Hitler salute and pretend to believe the propaganda being shouted from the stage. The dissonance between who she was and who she pretended to be created a kind of internal split that she could feel widening with each passing month. At night, alone in her apartment, she would sometimes break down, the weight of what she was doing crushing her. She could not talk to anyone about it. She could not seek comfort or advice. She carried the burden in complete isolation, and it was destroying her from the inside. The bombing raids that intensified throughout 1943 added another layer of chaos that Maria learned to exploit. When Allied planes dropped their payloads on Berlin, the city would descend into pandemonium. Buildings collapsed, fires raged, and in the aftermath, records were often lost or damaged. Maria began to use these raids strategically. If a particularly dangerous file crossed her desk, one that she could not delay through bureaucratic means, she would sometimes hold on to it until the next air raid. Then, in the confusion of the aftermath, when people were digging through rubble and trying to account for casualties, she would claim that certain files had been destroyed in the bombing. She kept a mental catalogue of which parts of the city had been hit hardest, which government buildings had sustained damage, and she would craft plausible stories about how documents had been lost in fires or buried under debris. It was a risky strategy because false reports could be verified, but in the chaos of a city under siege, verification was often impossible. Her closest call came in June of 1943. A Gestapo investigator named Werner Krauss began looking into a pattern of missing files from her department. He was methodical and suspicious by nature, the kind of man who trusted no one and saw conspiracies everywhere. Maria knew she was on his radar when he started asking her colleagues casual questions about her work habits, about whether she ever seemed nervous or made unusual requests. She could feel the net tightening. Krauss began sitting near her desk during lunch breaks, watching her, looking for any sign of irregularity. Maria knew she had to act completely normal, had to give him nothing to work with. So she did something counterintuitive. She volunteered to help him with his investigation. She approached Krauss directly, told him she had heard he was looking into departmental inefficiencies, and offered to review her own filing system to help identify any problems. It was a bold move, walking directly into the lion's mouth, but it worked. By appearing eager to cooperate, by showing no fear or defensiveness, she disarmed his suspicion. She spent 2 days going through files with him, pointing out legitimate clerical errors that had nothing to do with her sabotage, suggesting improvements to the tracking system that made her look like a dedicated employee concerned with efficiency. Krauss eventually concluded that the missing files were the result of incompetence by other staff members and poor interdepartmental communication, not deliberate sabotage. Maria had turned a potentially fatal investigation into an opportunity to enhance her cover, but the encounter left her shaken. She realized that no matter how careful she was, discovery was always one observant person away. By the autumn of 1943, Maria had refined her operation to an art form, but the human cost of what she was witnessing every day was beginning to break through her carefully constructed emotional barriers. She was not just shuffling papers. She was reading the intimate details of people's lives before they were destroyed. She knew the names of children who would be torn from their parents. She knew the addresses of families who would be dragged from their homes in the middle of the night. She knew the stories of ordinary people whose only crime was being Jewish or communist, or simply having said the wrong thing to the wrong person. Every file she saved was a victory, but every file she could not save haunted her. There were cases where the arrest order came from too high up, where too many people had already seen the documentation, where making it disappear would have been impossible without exposing herself. In those moments, Maria had to make a devastating choice: save herself to fight another day, or risk everything for one person. She chose survival, and the guilt of those decisions sat in her stomach like stones. She would see the names on the deportation lists that were posted internally, and she would know that some of those people had crossed her desk, and she had done nothing. The resistance network that Maria was loosely connected to began asking more of her as the war turned against Germany. They wanted her to do more than just hide files. They wanted intelligence, troop movements, names of Gestapo agents operating undercover, details about upcoming raids on resistance cells. Maria understood the logic, but she also understood the risk. Every piece of information she passed along was another thread that could lead back to her. She agreed to provide limited intelligence, but only when it could not be traced to her specific access. She would memorize details from reports that crossed her desk and pass them verbally through a complex chain of intermediaries, never writing anything down, never meeting the same contact twice. The information she provided helped the resistance avoid several Gestapo traps and warned Jewish families about imminent raids, giving them hours to flee. But it also meant she was no longer just a passive saboteur hiding files. She was an active spy, and the penalty for espionage was even more brutal than simple treason. If caught, she would not just be executed. She would be tortured for weeks to extract every name, every contact, every detail of the resistance network she had touched. The mental strain of operating at this level began to show in ways Maria could not completely control. She lost weight because food had no taste, and her stomach was constantly knotted with anxiety. She developed insomnia, lying awake for hours, replaying conversations from the office, analyzing every word she had said, every expression on her colleagues' faces, looking for signs that someone suspected her. She started having nightmares about interrogation rooms, about being strapped to a chair while Werner Krauss stood over her, asking questions she could not answer without condemning everyone she knew. She would wake up in a cold sweat, her heart racing, and have to remind herself that she was still free, still undiscovered, still alive. But the line between nightmare and reality was becoming dangerously thin. The paranoia that was necessary for survival was starting to consume her. She saw threats everywhere, read suspicion into every casual glance from a co-worker, interpreted every unexpected meeting request as the beginning of the end. She knew she was approaching a breaking point, but she also knew she could not stop. Too many lives depended on her staying in that position. The turning point came in November of 1943, when a massive file landed on her desk that changed everything. It was not a single arrest order, but a coordinated operation targeting over 80 people simultaneously, a planned raid on what the Gestapo believed was a major resistance cell operating in Berlin. The file contained names, addresses, meeting locations, and a detailed timeline for the arrests, which were scheduled to happen in 72 hours. Maria read through the documents with growing horror because she recognized some of the names. These were not distant strangers. These were people connected to the network she occasionally passed information to. If this raid succeeded, it would not just destroy the resistance cell. It would create a cascade of arrests as tortured prisoners gave up names under interrogation, and that cascade would eventually reach her. She had 3 days to decide what to do, and every option was catastrophic. If she did nothing, 80 people would be arrested and many would die, possibly including people who could identify her under torture. If she warned them, she would have to risk an enormous breach of security, and if the Gestapo noticed that the targets had fled just before the raid, they would know there was a leak inside headquarters. Maria spent one sleepless night weighing her options, and then she made a decision that she knew might be her last act of resistance. She could not save the entire file because it was too high profile, too many people had access to it, and its disappearance would trigger an immediate investigation that would lock down the entire building. But she could alter one crucial detail. She changed the date of the raid in her copy of the operational timeline, moving it forward by 48 hours, and then she arranged for that incorrect information to leak through her resistance contacts. The goal was simple. If the targets were warned that the raid was happening 2 days earlier than it actually was, they would scatter and hide, and when the Gestapo arrived at the real time, they would find empty apartments. It was not a perfect plan because some people might not get the warning in time, but it was the best she could do without completely exposing herself. She passed the false timeline through her network, And then she waited, knowing that within days she would find out if she had just saved 80 lives or signed her own death warrant. The day of the actual raid, Maria sat at her desk with her hands folded, trying to look absorbed in routine paperwork while her entire body felt like it was vibrating with tension. She could hear the SS officers preparing in the hallway, checking their weapons, reviewing the addresses one final time. They were confident, almost cheerful, anticipating an easy roundup of enemies who had no idea what was coming. Maria kept her eyes on her typewriter, her fingers moving mechanically across the keys, typing a report that she would not remember a single word of later. At precisely 6 in the morning, the teams left the building in a convoy of black vehicles, and Maria knew that within 2 hours she would know whether her gamble had worked. If the apartments were full of people caught sleeping, unaware and unprepared, then her warning had failed to reach them in time. If the apartments were empty, then she had succeeded, but she would also have to face the fury of her superiors who would demand to know how the targets had known to flee. The officers returned 4 hours later, and Maria could tell from the sound of their boots in the hallway that something had gone wrong. They were not marching with the rhythm of victory. They were stomping with frustration and anger. She heard shouting, furniture being kicked, doors slamming. When her supervisor emerged from the operational briefing, his face was red with rage. The raid had been a complete disaster. Out of 80 planned arrests, they had captured only 11 people, most of them elderly or sick individuals who had been unable to flee in time. The rest had vanished. Apartments were found abandoned, some with food still on tables and beds unmade, as if the occupants had left in a hurry just hours before the Gestapo arrived. Someone had warned them. Someone had leaked the operation. The building went into immediate lockdown. No one was allowed to leave. Internal security began interrogating every person who had access to the operational files, trying to find the source of the leak. Maria sat through 2 separate interrogations that day, and both times she relied on the same strategy that had saved her before. She showed no fear. When questioned about her handling of the files, she pulled out her meticulous documentation, showed them her processing logs, walked them through every step of her work with the confidence of someone who had nothing to hide. She even expressed outrage that someone had betrayed the operation, volunteered to help review security protocols, suggested improvements to prevent future leaks. Her performance was flawless because it had to be. She knew that any hesitation, any nervous gesture, any inconsistency in her story would be enough to trigger deeper investigation. The interrogators were looking for guilt, and she gave them only indignation and patriotic fervor. After 6 hours of questioning, they let her go, concluding that as a low-level secretary with limited access, she could not have been responsible for such a sophisticated leak. But Maria knew she had used up another of her 9 lives. The internal investigation continued for weeks, and the atmosphere in the building became poisonous with suspicion. Colleagues who had worked together for years now regarded each other with distrust. New security measures were implemented. Files were numbered and tracked with even more precision. Random searches of employees' belongings became routine. Maria adapted to each new restriction, finding small workarounds and vulnerabilities in systems that were designed to be foolproof, but were ultimately run by fallible human beings. She continued her work, though at a slower pace, more carefully selecting which files she could safely interfere with and which were too dangerous to touch. The psychological cost of the failed raid was complex. Maria had saved nearly 70 lives, and she should have felt triumphant. But she could not stop thinking about the 11 people who had been caught, the ones who were too old or too sick to flee in time. She had read their files. She knew they were being interrogated in the basement at that very moment, knew they would be deported within days. She had saved many, but she had not saved all, and the weight of those 11 lives sat on her conscience like an accusation. This was the impossible mathematics of resistance. Every victory was also a failure. Every life saved came with the knowledge of lives lost, and there was never a moment of pure triumph, only the grinding awareness that tomorrow she would have to do it all over again. By early 1944, the Reich was collapsing from multiple directions, and everyone inside Gestapo headquarters could feel it, even if no one dared speak it aloud. The Eastern Front was in full retreat. The Allies had landed in Italy, and the bombing of Berlin had become so relentless that entire sections of the city looked like lunar landscapes of craters and rubble. But the Nazi leadership responded to these failures not with introspection, but with escalating paranoia and brutality. If Germany was losing, it must be because of traitors, saboteurs, defeatists lurking within the homeland. The Gestapo intensified its operations, and Maria's desk became flooded with an avalanche of denunciations and arrest orders. People were being reported for the smallest infractions. A woman overheard saying she wished the war would end, a man who failed to donate enough to the war effort, teenagers who listened to banned American jazz music. The regime was eating itself, consuming its own citizens in a frenzy of suspicion, and Maria was drowning in the sheer volume of human misery crossing her desk every single day. The breaking point came on a cold February morning when Maria opened a file that made her hands start shaking so badly she had to set it down. It was an arrest order for her own cousin, a young man named Thomas, who had been denounced by a neighbor for making defeatist comments about the war. Thomas was 22 years old, a conscripted soldier who had been wounded on the Eastern Front and sent home to recover. According to the denunciation, he had told someone at a beer hall that Germany could not win the war and that continuing to fight was pointless suicide. It was the kind of opinion that thousands of Germans privately held by 1944, but saying it aloud was treason. The file indicated that Thomas was scheduled to be arrested within 48 hours, and given the current climate of paranoia, he would almost certainly be executed as an example to others. Maria stared at the file, at her cousin's name typed in official black letters, and she realized that this was the nightmare scenario she had always feared. It was no longer abstract. It was her family. She could not let Thomas be arrested, but saving him was exponentially more dangerous than saving strangers. If Thomas suddenly disappeared just before his scheduled arrest, and if anyone discovered that Maria had access to his file, the connection would be obvious. She would be exposed, arrested, and everyone in her family would be implicated. But the alternative was watching her cousin be dragged away to his death while she sat at her desk pretending not to know. Maria made her decision in less than 5 minutes. She could not live with herself if she did nothing, even if acting meant the end of everything. She made a copy of the arrest order, left work early claiming illness, and took a tram across the city to the address where Thomas was staying with friends. She found him there pale and thin from his injuries, and she told him everything. She told him about her work at Gestapo headquarters, about the file with his name on it, about the fact that he had less than 2 days before they came for him. Thomas stared at her in disbelief, struggling to reconcile the quiet cousin he had known his entire life with the confession of espionage and sabotage she was making. Maria did not have time for his shock. She gave him instructions. Leave Berlin immediately. Do not tell anyone where you are going, destroy any identification documents, and disappear into the chaos of refugees fleeing the advancing Soviet armies. She gave him what little money she had saved and the name of a contact in Hamburg, who might be able to help him get false papers. Thomas left that night, and Maria returned to her apartment knowing that she had just committed an act that could not be explained away, could not be disguised as bureaucratic error. If anyone investigated why Thomas had fled just before his arrest, the trail would lead directly to her. The next day, Maria went to work as usual, filed the arrest order for Thomas into the system as if nothing had happened, and waited for the SS officers to report back that the suspect had fled. When they did, the response was immediate and vicious. A full investigation was launched. Who had warned him? How had he known? Maria was questioned again, but this time the interrogators were more aggressive, more suspicious. They knew that Thomas Terweel was related to Maria Terweel, and that was not a coincidence they were willing to overlook. Maria stuck to her story. She had not seen her cousin in months, had no idea he was under investigation, and was as shocked as anyone that he had fled. But she could see in their eyes that they did not fully believe her. She was placed under surveillance. Her apartment was searched. Her colleagues were questioned about her behavior. The net was tightening, and Maria knew with absolute certainty that her time was running out. She had maybe weeks, possibly only days, before they found the evidence they needed to arrest her. And when that happened, everything she had worked for would be exposed, and everyone she had tried to save would be in danger. Maria made the hardest decision of her life in the first week of March 1944. She could not continue working at Gestapo headquarters knowing that she was under active surveillance and that every move she made was being watched and analyzed. The smart move, the survival move, would have been to resign quietly, claim health problems or family obligations, and fade into obscurity before they could build a case against her. But Maria understood something crucial. The moment she stopped working there, she lost her only leverage and her only protection. As long as she was inside the system, she had access to information about investigations, including investigations into herself. The moment she left, she would be blind, unable to see the threat coming until SS officers kicked down her door. So she made a different choice, one that was either brilliantly strategic or completely insane. She decided to stay at her post and accelerate her sabotage to save as many files as she could in whatever time she had left, operating under the assumption that she was already a dead woman and therefore had nothing left to lose. Over the next 6 weeks, Maria destroyed, hid, or altered more than 200 additional files. She stopped being cautious. She stopped worrying about perfect cover stories or elaborate bureaucratic justifications. She simply made documents disappear, and when questioned about missing files, she blamed the chaos of the constant bombing raids, the overwhelmed filing systems, the incompetence of other departments. She became almost reckless, pushing the boundaries of what she could get away with, and the strange thing was that her boldness seemed to work in her favor. The Gestapo was so consumed with hunting external enemies and so overwhelmed by the cascading disasters of the collapsing war effort that internal inefficiencies were increasingly tolerated. Officers were being pulled from administrative duties and sent to the front. Entire departments were being relocated out of Berlin to escape the bombing. In the chaos, Maria found more room to operate than she had ever had before, even as the noose around her neck tightened. But the surveillance continued, and Maria knew that the investigators assigned to her case were meticulous and patient. They were building their evidence slowly, cross-referencing her work history with missing files, interviewing people she had contact with, looking for patterns. In April of 1944, they made their first significant discovery. An informant who had been arrested revealed under interrogation that he had received a warning about a Gestapo raid, and the warning had been remarkably specific, including details that could only have come from inside headquarters. The investigators began mapping out who had access to those specific details, and Maria's name appeared on the list. It was not proof yet, but it was a thread, and Maria knew from her own work how the Gestapo pulled threads until entire networks unraveled. She began preparing for the inevitable. She burned personal papers that might implicate friends or family. She rehearsed her story over and over, memorizing every detail so that under interrogation she could repeat it without variation. She even wrote a short letter to her parents explaining nothing but telling them she loved them, and she hid it in a place where they might find it after her arrest. The end came on a bright morning in late April. Maria was at her desk, typing a report, when she noticed that the usual morning activity in the office had stopped. People were standing still, looking toward the main entrance. Then she saw them. 3 senior Gestapo officers walking directly toward her desk, with the unmistakable purposefulness of men conducting an arrest. Time seemed to slow down. Maria watched them approach, and in those final seconds she felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had known this moment was coming. She had lived with the certainty of it for months. In a way, the waiting had been worse than the reality. One of the officers spoke her name, not as a question but as a statement. "Maria Terviel, you are under arrest for treason, espionage and sabotage against the Reich." She stood up slowly, her hands steady, and she looked the officer directly in the eye. She did not resist, she did not cry, she did not beg. As they led her out of the building in handcuffs, past colleagues who stared in shock and whispered to each other, Maria felt something unexpected. Pride. They had caught her, yes, but they had caught her years too late. She had saved hundreds of lives. She had thrown sand in the gears of the Nazi murder machine for nearly 3 years. She had fought them from inside their own fortress, and they had not even known she was there until the very end. Now they would torture her for names, and she would give them nothing. They would try to break her, and she would not break. They would kill her, but they could not undo what she had already done. The files she had hidden were still hidden. The people she had saved were still alive. And even in handcuffs, walking toward the basement interrogation rooms, where so many had screamed before her, Maria Terviel knew that she had won the only victory that mattered. She had remained human in a system designed to destroy humanity. The interrogation began within hours of her arrest, and it was everything Maria had feared and prepared for. They took her to a windowless room in the basement of Prince Albrechtstrasse, the same building where she had worked for 3 years, but now she was on the other side of the door she had walked past every single day. The interrogators were professionals, trained in techniques designed to break even the strongest will. They started with questions, simple and direct. Who else was involved? Who had she passed information to? What resistance networks was she connected to? Maria gave them nothing. She admitted to hiding her cousin's file because he was family, a moment of weakness she claimed to regret, but she denied any broader conspiracy. She denied being part of any resistance network. She denied sabotaging any other files. She maintained this story through hours of questioning. Even as the methods became more aggressive, even as threats turned into physical violence. The pain was extraordinary, but Maria had prepared herself mentally for this. She knew that every hour she held out was another hour for her contacts to flee, to destroy evidence, to disappear. What Maria had not prepared for was the psychological torture that came after the physical. The interrogators brought in files, stacks of them, and they went through them one by one, reading her the names of people she had tried to save. Some of those people had been caught anyway through other means, and the interrogators described in graphic detail what had happened to them in the camps. They told her that her efforts had been pointless, that she had accomplished nothing, that every person she thought she had saved had died anyway. They showed her photographs of executed resistance members and claimed these were people she had worked with, people who had already given her up under interrogation. It was a mind game, a strategy to make her feel isolated and defeated, but Maria recognized it for what it was. She had worked in this building long enough to know their techniques. She knew they were lying, or at least exaggerating, trying to break her psychologically, because she had proven resistant to physical methods. She held on to one thought. Even if some of the people she saved had been caught later, some had not. Even if her victory was partial, it was still a victory. After 5 days of interrogation, the Gestapo realized they were not going to extract the information they wanted from Maria. She was too well trained, too mentally prepared, and too committed to protecting the people she had worked with. They moved her from the interrogation cells to Plötzensee prison, a facility on the outskirts of Berlin where political prisoners were held before execution. Maria knew what Plötzensee meant. It was the end of the line. This was where the Reich sent people it had already decided to kill, people who were waiting only for the paperwork to be processed and the execution date to be scheduled. She was placed in a small cell with 2 other women, both of them resistance members who had been arrested in separate operations. They did not speak about their cases, did not share details that might be overheard by guards, but in the quiet moments they shared small acts of kindness, a piece of bread divided 3 ways, a whispered word of encouragement, the simple human contact of holding hands in the darkness. Maria spent 6 weeks in Plötzensee, and during that time the war continued to deteriorate around her. She could hear the Allied bombers overhead almost every night, could feel the building shake when bombs landed nearby. The guards became increasingly nervous and brutal, taking out their fear and frustration on the prisoners. Rations were cut to starvation levels. Medical care disappeared entirely. Women died in their cells from untreated injuries and diseases, and their bodies would lie there for days before being removed. Maria watched people give up, watched them lose hope and simply stop eating, stop fighting, stop caring. She understood the temptation. It would have been easier to surrender to despair, to accept that she had fought and lost, and that the only thing left was to wait for death. But Maria refused to give them that satisfaction. She decided that if they were going to kill her, they would have to kill a woman who was still fighting, still defiant, still unbroken. Her trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than 2 hours. It was held in a makeshift courtroom inside the prison, presided over by a Nazi judge, who had already decided the verdict before hearing any evidence. Maria was charged with high treason, espionage, and undermining the German war effort. The prosecution presented testimony from Gestapo investigators who claimed to have evidence of her sabotage, though they could not prove the full extent of it, because so many of the files in question had been destroyed in bombing raids or lost in the chaos of the collapsing Reich. Maria was not allowed a real defense. Her court-appointed lawyer said perhaps 50 words during the entire proceeding. The judge delivered his verdict without deliberation, guilty on all counts, sentenced to death by guillotine. Maria heard the sentence without flinching. She had known it was coming from the moment they arrested her. The only question had been when, and now she had her answer. She was scheduled to be executed on August 5, 1944, less than 2 weeks away. Maria Terwiel was executed by guillotine at Plötzensee prison on August 5, 1944. She was 27 years old. According to the few records that survived the war, she walked to her execution with her head held high, refusing the chaplain's offer of final prayers, and her last words were reportedly a simple statement. She regretted nothing. The executioner's report, cold and bureaucratic, noted that the prisoner showed no signs of fear or resistance. Within minutes, her body was disposed of in an unmarked grave, and the Nazi regime attempted to erase her existence as thoroughly as they had erased the files she had hidden. For the Gestapo, Maria Terwiel was a problem that had been solved, a traitor who had been caught and eliminated. But what they did not know, what they could not have known in those final chaotic months of the war, was the true scope of what she had accomplished. The files she had destroyed, the names she had buried, the lives she had saved through 3 years of meticulous sabotage represented a legacy that would outlive the Reich itself. When the war ended in May of 1945 and the Allied forces occupied Berlin, the Gestapo headquarters on Prinz Albrechtstrasse was a burned-out shell, its records scattered and destroyed. Investigators trying to piece together the crimes of the Nazi regime found massive gaps in the documentation, entire categories of arrests that seemed to have been planned but never executed, resistance members who should have been caught but somehow escaped detection. For decades, historians attributed these gaps to the general chaos of the war's final years, to bombing raids that destroyed records, to the incompetence of an overwhelmed bureaucracy. But as more evidence emerged, as survivors came forward with their stories, a different picture began to form. People remembered warnings that had come from inside the Gestapo itself. They remembered files that had mysteriously disappeared. They remembered narrow escapes that seemed too fortunate to be coincidental. And slowly, painstakingly, researchers began to trace some of these miracles back to their source. A young secretary named Maria Terwiel, who had worked inside the heart of Nazi terror and sabotaged it from within. The exact number of lives Maria saved will never be known, because the very nature of her work was to make people disappear from the Nazi system, to erase the paper trail that would have led to their arrests. Conservative estimates based on surviving evidence suggest she interfered with at least 600 individual cases, though the real number could be significantly higher. Some of the people she saved never knew they had been in danger. They never knew that their names had been on a list, that an arrest order had been written, that a Gestapo team had been prepared to drag them away in the middle of the night. They lived because a woman they never met decided their paperwork was not important enough to process, and they went on to survive the war, to rebuild their lives, to have children and grandchildren who exist today because of a decision made by a secretary in 1943. Maria's story remained almost completely unknown for decades after the war. Unlike more famous resistance figures, who had networks to commemorate them, or dramatic escape stories that captured public imagination, Maria's resistance was quiet, bureaucratic, and hidden. It was not until the early 2000s, more than 50 years after her execution, that researchers working in newly opened archives began to piece together the full story of what she had done. Testimonies from survivors were cross-referenced with fragmentary Gestapo records. Patterns in missing files were analyzed, and slowly the portrait emerged of a woman who had fought one of the most dangerous and lonely battles of the entire war. In 2003, the German government officially recognized Maria Terwiel as a resistance fighter and issued a posthumous pardon, erasing the Nazi conviction for treason. A small memorial plaque was placed on the site where Gestapo headquarters once stood, listing her name among other resistance members who had been executed there. But even today, Maria's story remains largely unknown outside of academic circles and specialized Holocaust education. She has no dramatic movie, no best-selling biography, no widespread recognition in popular culture. And perhaps that is the final tragedy of Maria Teruel's story. That a woman who saved hundreds of lives at the cost of her own, who spent 3 years fighting the Nazi regime from inside its own headquarters, who faced torture and execution without breaking, remains a footnote in history. Her story challenges our comfortable narratives about resistance because it was not glamorous or dramatic. It was typing and filing and bureaucratic sabotage done by a quiet young woman who would have been completely unremarkable in any other time. But in the darkness of Nazi Germany, that unremarkable secretary became a hero who proved that one person, armed with nothing but courage and access to the machinery of evil, could save lives that the regime had already condemned to death. Her legacy lives on not in monuments or medals, but in the descendants of the people she saved, in families that exist because a woman whose name they may never know decided that human life mattered more than her own survival. That is the story they did not want you to know. That is the truth that was almost lost to history. And that is why Maria Teruel deserves to be remembered.